Welcome to True Drew Podcast, your source for all things Nancy Drew. I'm your host, Avery, and on this podcast, we'll discuss everything from the Nancy Drew books, to computer games, to movie adaptations, and TV shows. Nothing is off the table. So if you're a True Drew, you'll definitely want to tune in for this podcast. Hello, and welcome to another episode of True Drew Podcast, and welcome to another year. It is 2024, and I don't know what to do with myself. I'm going to be completely honest. I feel a bit like a time traveler because even as I'm saying it's 2024, it is 2023 as I'm recording this, because with a podcast like this, you know, we're reading these Nancy Drew books in chronological order. It requires a lot of reading ahead, and so I'm several books ahead when each podcast comes out each week. So, yeah. I guess you could say I'm a bit of a time traveler. So the next thing I'm about to say is probably old news if you follow me on Instagram, and our Instagram handle is True Drew Podcast. I just recently, at the time of this podcast recording, came into 2 barrister bookcases that I won from a local auction, and I am so excited because, as you all know, my Nancy Drew collection has grown quite a bit, and I needed a place to house all of these incredible books. Because at the beginning of starting this podcast, I mentioned that my dad and I went to an estate sale in Alabama back in April of this past year, and I found 70 to 80 books. Well, the other day, this has been a few weeks ago, I went to a local used bookstore in my town, and I go to this store all the time. I kind of just look at where the Nancy Drew books usually are, and usually I go out empty-handed. There's nothing there. Well, on this particular visit, I found 40 to 50 books that I did not have, from like the 100 to 175 range, like the newer books that were made in the 80s and 90s. And I grabbed those things and I ran out of the store. I mean, I paid for them first, but I was like so excited. So needless to say, I needed some more bookshelf space for all of these incredible Nancy Drew books. And I also thought it would be a cool place to kind of display some of the game cases for the Her Interactive games. And I've since acquired a really cool Nancy Drew board game from the 50s and a lunchbox. So I can't wait to nerd out and put that all in that space. I think one of the coolest things about the Nancy Drew community is just sharing all of these, our favorite books and our collections. So if you guys want to see my collection that I have displayed in these bookcases, I have a highlight on my Instagram, which is True Drew Podcast. You can find us over there. And I kind of take you all on a tour through all of my favorite books and just everything. So if you'd like to see that, it is over on Instagram. Now, we're going to dive right into this episode. This is episode 13, and we're going to be talking about the clue of the Broken Locket. I do want to preface this by saying I'm going to apologize. If you can hear my dryer in the background, it is running right now. Long story short, my husband is a magician, and he is dyeing some foam eggs, and they have to dry in our dryer. It sounds very odd. It's not just regular laundry. It has a purpose. So anyway, if you can hear that, I'm going to just go ahead and apologize. Now, the clue of the Broken Locket. Where to start? So this book was written in 1934, and I actually happen to have a copy that is an original. So I have an original and a revised, and I thought it would be super fun for this episode to compare the two and see how similar they are. Well, spoiler alert, they are nothing alike. As far as I'm concerned, these are 2 completely different books, and I am shocked. I read the original not too long ago, maybe half a year ago or so, and I thought, oh yeah, I think that's pretty close to, you know, the revised that I read as a kid. No, it's completely different. Different characters, different setting, different plot. So essentially, for this episode, we're going to be talking about 2 separate books. So because of that, I thought it would be better to go ahead and tackle the original book in its entirety. We'll go through the cover ratings and the synopsis and plot and everything, and then we'll go through the revised book and do the exact same thing. So for that reason, this episode will be a little bit longer, but I hope that you all will enjoy it because it is pretty fascinating how different these books are. So we'll go ahead and take a closer look at these 3 separate covers for the Clue of the Broken Locket. And of course, I post these on our Instagram on Wednesdays before the episode comes out if you want to take a look at them. But the first cover from the 1930s shows Bess, George, and Nancy together on the cover for, I believe, the first time. And we have Bess wearing this green ensemble. She's got more blonde hair, and Nancy has more red hair. And I think this is the first version from the 30s where we see her with this red hair. And she's, of course, wearing blue, and George is wearing red. They all have the super short hairstyles from the 30s, and they are looking at a locket they seem to have found on the beach. Now, in the second edition of this cover, I can't really even tell Bess and George apart. I'm assuming Nancy is the one with super blonde hair who is crouched next to this boat that looks broken. Of course it's broken because boat accidents always happen in Nancy Drew books. But Nancy's holding up this locket, and again, I mean, if this is Bess and George, I wouldn't know it because they both have reddish and brownish hair. It's a very odd cover. Also, speaking of boat accidents, I was telling myself the other day I was going to start this tally of Nancy's near-death disasters, and so far, up to the point of this book, we've had at least 6 boat accidents. We've been locked in somewhere twice. We've been kidnapped 3 times, hit over the head at least 3 times, and thrown into a cistern. Now, thrown into a cistern is under unique experiences. I probably need to add almost hit by a car, too, because I feel like Nancy's at least been mowed or almost mowed down by a car 3 times up to this point. She's kind of a magnet for disaster. That's all I'm saying. Now, as for the third cover, we have Nancy and Bess and George in a boat, and there's an older man kind of leering over their shoulder, and he's got a pipe in his mouth. It looks kind of creepy. But I accidentally said 3 covers. There's 4. The 4th cover is the one that I remember on the revised books that I had growing up. And we see Nancy, Bess, and George wading through what looks like a swamp. It's very like dark purple and black, and they're carrying their shoes with them. And of course, the Broken Locket. Now, of course, I like to come up with funny cover spoofs of these books, and I found one on the internet that I cannot not discuss. It's hilarious. So that third cover where the older man is kind of looking over their shoulder, someone on the internet has edited the book title to be, "Is that creepy old man still watching us?" And it's so funny. Now, I came up with a cover spoof for the last edition where Nancy, Bess, and George are wading through the swamp, and I came up with the mystery of why are we wading through a swamp with matching accessories? Because they all have these perfectly matching outfits. Like, I think Bess is wearing blue and she's got the blue shoes. Nancy's wearing yellow and the yellow shoes, and George has pink. It looks interesting. It's like, wow, y'all are, I mean, they're not as dressed up as on some covers, but they're matching their accessories, just going around in the swamp like swamp people. It's interesting. So I gave these books a cover rating of 4 magnifying glasses because I like all the covers. They're all very interesting, very colorful. They all definitely go for something and they achieve it. But I like it for the most reason because I think Nancy, Bess, and George are all on this cover for the first time, and I thought that was really neat. Now, I did not mention at the beginning of this podcast episode, but this is the 11th book in the series, and I'm just going to jump right in and start with the original, and then we'll come back and talk about the revised. So, some of the characters for the original book include Johnny and Kitty Blair, who are truly horrible, and we'll see why in a little bit. There are the babies, Jay and Janet, Phil, Boots, and Mitzi Dunbar, Rodney, who is the Blair's chauffeur, and Colleen, who is their nursemaid. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm already getting those 1930s vibes from some of these names like Kitty Blair and Boots and Mitzi, and then the fact that they have a chauffeur and a nursemaid. I know that, the Drews have a housekeeper, and there's some things in the 70s and the rewritten versions that are kind of different, but this was quite a trip reading this book. It was so culturally different than anything I've ever read. So without further ado, we're going to dive right into the synopsis. Carson is having to draft some adoption papers for twins, Jay and Janet, and tells Nancy he's worried that the Blairs, an actor and actress couple, don't care about the children at all. They come by to sign the papers and keep talking about how big the twins will be in show business and how they're going to show them off to their friends. Kitty Blair mentions the twins were found with a mysterious locket and she's going to destroy it so they don't know who their real parents are, but Nancy says they have a right to know. Later, after the Blairs have left, Nancy and Carson get a telegram saying not to let the twins be adopted, signed Broken Heart. Nancy picks Bess up to go to the Blairs' estate to try and find the locket and comes across the Blairs' friends, the Dunbars, and offers them a ride. The Blairs throw a party complete with alcohol and cigarettes, risque, and Kitty says she's going to burn the locket. Nancy calls Hannah and asks her to bring some doll clothes and a locket she has so she can switch them with the twins' locket and clothes. When Kitty throws the fake articles into the fire, the chauffeur Rodney faints and Nancy wonders if he could be connected to the twins. Nancy and Bess go to watch Jay and Janet because Colleen doesn't like to work, and while waiting in a creek on the property, a mysterious woman sneaks over to the twins' carriage and kisses them. Nancy has a hunch it's their real mother. It turns out that Rodney has a twin sister named Ruth, a nurse from the orphanage who greatly cared for the twins. Colleen, the Blairs' nurse, is horrible at caring for the babies and repeatedly calls Nancy for help so she can run off with her boyfriend or parade around in Miss Blair's clothes. Nancy, concerned about the babies after they get injured on Colleen's watch, suggests they hire Ruth. They do, and fire Colleen, who tries to frame Nancy for stealing some of Kitty's jewelry. Nancy also follows a lead with a fisherman, Enos Crinkle, and finds the other half of the twins' locket. She sees initials on it and is able to figure out, through some of the other clues she's found, who the twins' real parents are and get them away from the Blairs. So the newspaper headline synopsis that I came up with is Teen Sleuth locates twins' missing parents, aspiring actors the Blairs humiliated. Now, I took down several direct quotes and things that I noticed from the original. The first thing that I said was the Blairs act like they're buying furniture instead of adopting kids. They keep talking about training them for the stage. So Johnny and Kitty Blair, that is the only reason they're adopting Jay and Janet. And they just keep talking about how they're going to be acrobats, and they even throw the kids around at some points. It's really weird. I mean, this was the 30s. I guess this was back before people really did a welfare check or really did background checks on people. They were just like, yeah, we got too many kids at this orphanage. You can have them. So Nancy, of course, is distressed about this, and I wrote down this direct quote. Carson says, "I'm afraid my hands are tied," where it comes to helping Nancy get the babies away from the Blairs. But Nancy says, "Mine aren't." And I loved that. I was like, she knows that her dad can't really step in and help, but Nancy's like, well, that doesn't stop me from helping. Now, my next note is the Blairs' estate, their home, is called Jolly Folly. Jolly Folly. Like, what is it with rich people naming their estate? It's like, it's the Biltmore, the Jolly Folly. It sounds like a pirate ship, honestly. With a name like that, I guess we can assume that good times are had by all that visit there. More on that in just a second. Okay, so I already mentioned this, but the Blairs throw baby Jay in the air, and the Dunbars let their young girl Mitzi carry Janet around. And Mitzi's only like 3 or 4 herself. And yeah, these parents are not parenting. They're not doing their job. They're just obviously in it for the fame and the fortune. I guess twins were a hard commodity to come by back then. Now, back to the activities of Jolly Folly. Nancy observes the adults get looser by the drinks that Johnny Blair mixes for them on the sideboard. And I said, blame it on the alcohol. And their cigarette smoke is also mentioned in this book. I thought it was so scandalous because Harriet does such a job in the revising of the book. She really scrubs out any of that. I mean, of course, Nancy herself's not going to do it, but usually you don't even see mentioning of alcohol and cigarettes being used by other characters, so pretty crazy. My next note is just Kitty Blair said, "I can't stand to hear babies cry. Someone take them away." And I was like, woman, you've had them for less than 24 hours, but she's just like so out of touch with reality. Now, there's also a scene where Colleen, who is the nursemaid who's taking horrible care of these babies, she falls down the stairs with the baby bottles, which are of course made of glass, and she cuts her arm or her hand open, and she says it's only a flesh wound. And I couldn't help but think of Monty Python. He's like, it's only a flesh wound. There's some really bad things that happen to the help in these books, because Rodney, the chauffeur, he faints when the Blairs throw the locket and the baby's clothes, what they think are the real ones. They throw the fake ones Nancy's brought into the fireplace. He faints and falls on the burning locket, and gets a heart-shaped burn on his forehead. Ouch. Now, this next quote I thought was hilarious because Colleen, the nursemaid, she's very just rough around the edges. You get that impression from her. But there's a direct quote that I have from her. She's dating someone in the book, and she says, "He's the most handsome man I've ever met. Of course, he has red hair, but you get used to it." Like, what? Excuse me? As someone with red hair, I am greatly offended. Now, granted, Nancy has Titian hair, blonde hair, so she wouldn't have taken offense to this, but it would have been funny if she was saying this to Nancy and she had red hair. Now, my next note says, Nancy and Bess come back from watching the babies and catch Colleen trying on Kitty Blair's clothes. So, Colleen rips the dress, trying to get it off, and Nancy has to fix it. And when Nancy takes the dress back, she notices Kitty's frivolous things around her room and says, "No wonder the Blairs owe the butcher and the baker." I love that. No wonder they owe the butcher and the baker, because right before this happened, there was someone who came and delivered groceries, I think, or came to the house, but they were saying, you know, we're not going to deliver these anymore because the Blairs owe us money on their tab. And Nancy overheard that, so she knows they are not paying their bills. They're living it up and they're putting on this show, but they can't afford anything. So the next thing that I wrote down is Hannah Gruen says, "Mysteries are all right, but children are another matter." So I thought it was very funny. Hannah was so worried that Nancy was going to bring these twin babies home and she was going to have to take care of them, which, I mean, valid reasoning, Hannah. But it was so funny. I figured Hannah would have been more like, "Oh, they're so cute." But she was just like, "Nope. I already raised you as a kid, Nancy, and I don't want to raise any more." Another weird thing about this original version of The Clue of the Broken Locket is that George doesn't come in until page 100. For most of this book, Nancy and Bess are working as a team, or Nancy's working with her dad, Carson. So I found that kind of interesting. Also, for the parts of the book that George was in, and Bess was as well, there was no fat shaming, which I found very interesting. I was like, did Harriet put all of this in the revised versions? I'm very curious. If I get a hold of another original book, I'll have to let you know. But there were several instances where Nancy, Bess, and George had lunch together, and George did not make one comment about Bess's weight. So I was happy about that. Now, my next note says, Enos Crinkle. What an unfortunate name. Because I thought it was Anus Crinkle. And I was like, Enos, Anus, I don't know. It's a horrible name. What is with these names in some of these books? Now, the next part of this podcast is What's Cooking with Hannah Gruen. And Hannah did quite a bit of cooking in the original book. She really didn't do any cooking in the revised. Some of the things that Hannah made in the 1930s version of this book are hot cakes, so pancakes, creamed chicken, souffle, and frosted cakes. All of those things sound pretty tasty. Now, as for the add that to your resume section of this episode, for the original, I said that Nancy was a master of substitutions, and I don't mean baking. So we see Nancy being quick on her feet and thinking fast, and she quickly calls Hannah and says, "Hey, bring me some of my doll clothes and my locket, and I'll switch them out for these lockets and clothes that belong to Jay and Janet." And I thought that was really good thinking on her part, because otherwise she never would have found who the parents were, and these kids never would have known who their mom and dad were. Also, do you want to know how these kids became separated from their parents to begin with? I'll give you 2 hints. Boat accident. I'm telling you, somebody was traumatized by boats that wrote these books. Now, as for the last thing that Nancy could add to her resume, I put babysitter, because Colleen was constantly calling her. I think Nancy went over there 3 or 4 separate times. And of course, she's sleuthing and trying to solve this mystery of who the baby's parents are too, but she was doing quite a bit of babysitting. When it comes to the things that I liked about the original version of The Clue of the Broken Locket, I loved the language and the details. Some of the 1930s slang and details are kind of outdated, and I may not have known exactly what they were talking about at times, but I really liked it. It was very immersive. It made me really realize this was a different time and there were different things going on in the world. I also really liked how exaggerated the characters were. Like, the Blairs are horrible people, and you're well aware of it, and you hate them, and they're just bad characters. But I liked how exaggerated and flamboyant they were. I also love the fact that in this book there was no fat shaming from George towards Bess, and they never argued. They got along perfectly, which never happens. Now, as for the things I didn't like about the original, I can't think of anything. I thought it was an overall really good book, and so for that reason, I decided to give it a magnifying glass rating of 3 magnifying glasses. It was a pretty solid book. Now, on to the revised version. As I was saying, this is a completely different book, so that's why I broke the episode up this way. I thought it would confuse people if I tried to compare them side by side. So, the characters for the revised version of The Clue of the Broken Locket are Lawrence Baker, who is a cabin owner, Cecily Curtis, who is renting the cabin, Henry Winch, who is a caretaker, Miss Hosking, which she apparently rents cottages in the area, Nico Van Dyke, who is a band member of the Flying Dutchmen, and Carl and Vince Driscoll, who have some twin kids. Now, before I jump into the synopsis for the revised version, I thought it would be interesting to discuss some of the main differences between the original and the revised. So, the original book has 25 chapters, whereas the revised has only 20, and you will see this pretty much across the board, not just for this book. The original was written in 1934. It was revised in 1965. The original book starts with Nancy and Hannah wondering what's troubling Carson, and he talks of an adoption for some twins going to some horrible people. The revised book starts with Mr. Drew giving Nancy a key and basically telling her to solve the mystery of why some lady named Cecily Curtis wants to rent the lake house of Lawrence Baker. This was a very odd and flimsy start to a mystery. I was like, why does it matter? Never look a gift Airbnb rental in the mouth. But they just speculate, like, why is this woman renting this place? I'm like, why can't this woman rent this place? What's the problem? Now, the key differences in the locket. The locket in the original story tells the twins who their parents are, but the locket in the revised edition of this book belonged to a distant relative of Cecily's from the Civil War and had a note in it about treasure. I mean, I'm all for a story where we're hunting down treasure and we get to find secret passageways, but it just seems kind of far-fetched. Now onto the synopsis for the revised edition of The Clue of the Broken Locket. Nancy is given a key by her father and told to investigate why some woman named Cecily Curtis wants to rent a lake house from his rich friend in the fall, which seems like a perfectly reasonable time to go for a vacation if you ask me. Carson has received the key and the note from the caretaker Henry Winch, who says he's scared and quits. Nancy, Bess, and George set off and get a hankering for lobster on the way. Bess loses her earring on a bridge after they see a couple fighting. Nancy tries to retrieve it and the bridge collapses. When Nancy, Bess, and George go to the lake house, they encounter a red-haired girl like the girl from the restaurant bridge mishap, but she runs from them. Shortly after, Cecily, the actual girl from the restaurant, shows up with her cat. She must have a doppelganger. Cecily gets knocked out mysteriously, and she and Nancy are almost crushed by a rolling log. Then they try to investigate a stone house Cecily thinks is connected to a treasure note she found in her locket. But they're told to go away, and they see the haunted boat Miss Hoskins warned them about. There's also unexplained humming noises coming from the cabin, and meanwhile we have a side plot involving Cecily's boyfriend Nico, who is a singer in a band called the Flying Dutchmen. Nancy thinks, based on a different quality record they bought at a soda shop, that the music is being pirated. Nancy lets George and Cecily look into that while she is invited by the Driscolls to look around their property. She climbs up on the roof and is locked out, and then once down, Bess tells her the cabin has been ransacked. Cecily goes to Baltimore to see Nico, but Nico shows up at the cabin, having had the same idea to see her. Nancy, Bess, and George find the other half of a locket and are convinced it belongs to Cecily's red-haired doppelganger. Nancy wonders if perhaps her doppelganger has been kidnapped. Susan, the red-haired girl, turns out to be Cecily's cousin, and the twins are hers. She, her husband, and kids were on a camping trip, and her husband was hit by someone in a car and died. Nancy also catches the Driscolls in their pirated music scheme. Did it sound like I was confused through the reading of this synopsis? Because I was. It's all over the place. Now, the newspaper headline synopsis that I came up with, the revised edition for this book, is Pirated Music Scheme of Flying Dutchman Group Unearthed by Young Detective. This was such a weird book. So here are some notes that I took down for this one. So my first note is there's a rich friend of Carson's. He's in Europe and he's asking him to facilitate this rental agreement. Wow, the lives these people lead. Also, the fact that they're suspicious that Cecily is renting this lake house in the fall, like that seems like the ideal time to get away and just spend time in nature is in the fall. I don't get why these people are suspicious. Is it because it's the fall? Is it because she doesn't want to do boating activities because it's colder? I mean, why would she want to? Something disastrous is probably going to happen. Is it because she's a single woman? Like, I don't get it. So this next part I thought was hilarious. Henry Winch, who is the caretaker for this cabin, he puts his final notice and he sends a letter out and it basically says, hire somebody else. I'm scared. Like, what a way to quit your job. Hire someone else. I'm scared. I can't deal with this anymore. For my next note, I have a description of Bess, which I did not like. It says, Bess was a very pretty blonde, inclined to be overweight. Like, why? Why does it always have to be about Bess's weight? There's also the scene where Nancy, Bess, and George stop to get lobster, and Nancy is trying to get Bess's earring because it fell under this bridge, and this girl, who turns out to later be Cecily, runs across it, and it collapses, and they all fall in the water. And I wrote down, so in a shocking turn of events, George has a normal human reaction to something. Instead of being snarky and blaming the bridge collapse on Bess's weight, or mocking Bess for wanting her earring back because she's, flighty or she cares about her earring, she blames the restaurant. I was shooketh. Like, George may be a jerk, but she wasn't a jerk here, so congratulations, George. My next note says, Miss Hosking, the lady who rents out cabins to people, tells them a spooky story about how this boat with like 50 passengers went down on the lake, and now people think they've seen the ship and the ghosts of the passengers. And she begs Nancy not to go to the cottage, which is coincidentally near where it happened. And Nancy's basically like, cool story, can you give me directions on how to get there? Also, Cecily, the red-haired girl, has a black cat named Satin, but at first I read it as Satan, and I was like, oh, go. But it was Satin. I was like, aw, that's cute. As a pet. I'm still holding out for a mentioning of Togo, Nancy's dog, but so far, no dice. My next note is just the Driscolls in the stone house have twins, and Miss Driscoll locks them in the attic. Yikes. And also the name of this place is called Pudding Stone Lodge. I don't know. Were they just putting stones in random places and they just threw this thing together? It's just a weird name. Now this next part I laughed out loud when I was reading this book, and I put pirated music, the Flying Dutchman. So basically Nico Van Dyke, who is Cecily's boyfriend, who you can't tell me that's not a play off of Dick Van Dyke. Like, I'm sorry, but no. This was also revised in the 1960s, 1965, so I think that Harriet must have had a thing for Dick Van Dyke. I don't know. But anyway, what the heck? Like, he's in a band called the Flying Dutchman, and then the plot point is that the music may be pirated. You can't make this stuff up. You can't. So my next note is that George apparently has an epiphany that she's not very nice to Bess. What a shock. So George has this revelation after she rolls down a hill into some thorn bushes, and Bess takes care of her. And when Bess and Nancy tell George she should lay down, she says what she really needs is a juicy steak. Like, who thinks about food all the time now, George? Also, who rolls down a hill almost to a thorn bush death and then is like, you know what, I could really go for a steak with some A1 sauce right now. Like, I'm sorry, I once jumped over a 2-story balcony to get away from a spider that my cousin was trying to throw on me because I have severe arachnophobia, and I almost rolled into some thorn bushes, and I can guarantee you I wasn't thinking about a steak. I was thinking about my imminent demise. So, George needs to get her priorities in order. Now, the last note that I have down for the revised is Nancy sinks her canoe, and I said, yet another boating accident. Like, when are these girls going to learn? Like, you and water do not mix. Don't get on the boat. You can get on a plane. Well, actually, I feel like there was a book where someone opened a door and they almost got sucked out of the plane, but still, you should stick to planes and not boats. Oh, wait, I missed one note. So, apparently, they're looking for this iron bird because the note in Cecily's locket says, look for an iron bird. And the one they've been looking for was a flamingo. Not a majestic eagle or a hawk, but a flamingo. in Maryland or wherever they are. I was like, that's weird. Also, the note was left by some of her family from the Civil War. You mean to tell me that they knew what flamingos were? Like, I find that a little hard to believe. Now, as I mentioned before, Hannah Gruen didn't do too much cooking in this book, so I'm going to jump right into the add that to your resume section. So I put that Nancy is a master at earring retrieval. I mean, granted, the bridge collapses, but that wasn't her fault. That was Cecily's fault. But she's great at retrieving earrings. I also put that Nancy is a swamp trekker. Like, I know that this is up north, but I would still be afraid to trek through the swamp. Maybe that's because I've been to the Everglades and down south, and it's kind of scary, but Nancy has no problem doing it. And the last skill that Nancy can put on her resume is that she's a pirated music expert. Like, she only had to look and listen to these 2 records, and she suddenly knew that it was pirated music. Go figure. So, as for the things that I liked about the revised version, I liked that Bess and George had a sweet cousin moment, and George realized that she treats Bess like crap. Now, should she have had to roll almost into a thorny death to figure that out? No, I don't think so, but maybe that's what it takes for some people. And yeah, that's the only thing that I liked about the revised. Now onto the things I didn't like. This book was so scattered. It was weird. It was out there. Like, first we're looking for this Civil War treasure, and there's twins, and there's doppelgangers, and then there's also pirated music, and it was so bizarre. The next thing that I wrote down was Nico Van Dyke, Flying Dutchman. Seriously? Like, it was so funny. I almost spit out my water when I was reading this, and it was like, the Flying Dutchmen think their music's being pirated. And I was like, wait, what? This is, I don't know. There were just too many weird side plots with this book for me to really enjoy it. Like, it was just, they played up things that I think they didn't need to play up. And then it all ended and connected, but I didn't like the book. So for the revised edition of The Clue of the Broken Locket, I give it a 1 magnifying glass rating. And the original I gave 3. I think it was way better. I think that the plot made more sense. And was it dated? Yeah, in a lot of ways it was, but I really, really liked it. And the revised just left me so confused on everything. I was like, this is the weirdest book that I've read. I'm sure it won't be the weirdest, but it seems like it up to this point. So yeah, that concludes this special episode comparing the original The Clue of the Broken Locket to the revised version. I hope you all liked this. As you can see, they were 2 completely different books, which was kind of wild. Now, for next week's episode, we're going to break it up and do something a little bit different. For episode number 14, we're going to talk about The Secret of the Old Clock, the Her Interactive computer game. So I'm so excited to talk about this with you all. I can't wait to break up the podcast and start doing a few episodes about the games because they are so fun. After this episode, I will be going in order with Secrets Can Kill and going through the games that way. I just thought it would be cool to tackle The Secret of the Old Clock because we've just recently talked about the book and several of the books that the game is based on. So if you all are a fan of the Her Interactive computer games, you will not want to miss next week's episode. Until next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of True Drew Podcast. If you'd like to stay up to date on the latest information and new episodes, our Instagram is True Drew Podcast. Or for general inquiries, you can email us at truedrewpodcast@gmail.com.